Hello everyone, we will just get started in 1 or 2 minutes just while the other attendees arrive. So hello to everyone. We're starting to get good morning everyone. We're starting to get a few more attendees arriving. We'll just give everyone 1 more minute and then we shall make a start. But hello and welcome to all. And thank you for joining us. Everyone, just 1 more minute to 11:35 a.m. our Australian Central Daylight Saving Time, and then we'll take it away. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for posting in the chat, and we'll be utilising the chat responses today as well. Okay. Hello and welcome to day 2 of the National Association of Enabling Educators of Australia Symposium for 2020. My name is Dr. Anthea Fudge and I am a member of the Executive Committee of NAEEA, and I'm one of your hosts for this final day of our 2020 Symposium. Myself, Sarah Haddam, and the Symposium Working Group would like to thank you all for your strong participation and commitment to this important suite of discussions that we are having about, well, what is the future of enabling education in Australia? It was really wonderful to have such a strong number of people engaging in the symposium sessions yesterday, and I'm sure that will continue today with some more fantastic panel chairs and panelists. So I would just like to first off respectfully acknowledge the First Nations peoples and their elders past and present, who are traditional custodians of the land that we meet on across Australia today. We acknowledge their spiritual relationship with country, and here at the UniSA campus in Adelaide, I acknowledge that I am on Kaurna land. So very briefly, some quick housekeeping for those who may have not been able to attend yesterday at yesterday's welcome. We'll be utilising a webinar session format for each panel session today. Mics will remain muted for attendees, but please use the chat to post your questions and discussions, and questions will be responded to in the second half of each panel session. We will also have some polls today and also a Padlet for the digital pedagogy session, which we will share the link in the chat for you all. We also have a lunchtime session as a normal Zoom session where it's not set up as a webinar, so participation is definitely encouraged if you would like to meet some others and chat about today and anything else that's been going on. The sessions will all be recorded and will be made available later via the NAEEA website, which you can see on the screen there, and YouTube following the symposium. And of course, if you would like, feel free to share via Twitter at 01NAEEA and use the hashtag NAEEA2020. So for today's session, we are building on discussions from yesterday that were started off with some lovely shared stories from students who had gone through their education via enabling. It was really lovely they were able to share their stories, and it was really clear from the polls that we need to continue to share their voices more loudly so that others can have a better understanding of how important enabling education can be to the individual at a personal level, but also how there are some really clear economic and broad social benefits as well. It was also great to have a summary and some pertinent questions posed by our final panel yesterday that were unpacking the AQF. So today for session 3, we will be discussing the Job Ready Graduates package with some great panel members. We will have the lunch as mentioned, and then the afternoon session looking at digital enabling pedagogy, and then a final session to wrap up the day looking at some future directions and top 3 priorities for the sector and future collaborations through our NAEEA Executive Chair, Karen Seary. So I hope you all enjoy the day, and I'll leave it off to Sarah now to continue.
Thank you, Anthea, and it's lovely to see you all again for day 2. It was a fantastic day yesterday, and really looking forward to today's 2 sessions. Before we introduce our very special panel chair and panelists, given that Anthea and myself and 2 of our panelists from yesterday, Associate Professor Sharon King and Victoria Fielding, are from UniSA College, and as the host, we thought that we would just give you a bit of an outline of the enabling programs that we run at UniSA College. Given that there is a great diversity across our sector, we wanted to just outline our specific pathway options for students going into higher education. And we've got 3 different main pathways. We have the Foundation Studies program, which is our most popular program. We have about 1,000 students enroll into that every year. That is fee-free, open access. And students complete 8 courses, a blend of academic literacy courses plus discipline-specific courses. We have the diploma, suite of diploma programs. They are for students who have an ATAR of 50. These are students who may have just not achieved the ATAR that they required for their pathway and can complete the first year of the diploma and have guaranteed entry into a linked pathway. This is different to the Foundation Studies. With Foundation Studies, there is no entry requirement. And so we often have students enroll into that pathway who may not have studied for 20 years, want to have a career change, and also have that opportunity. Or, you know, again, we may have students who may not have had a good experience at high school and come through that pathway. Now, we also have the Aboriginal Pathway Program, and that is offered across our state. So we can see there the Aboriginal Pathway Program is offered in Ceduna, Port Lincoln, Whyalla, Mount Gambier, and of course in Adelaide Metro. So we have 9 programs that we offer at the college and 26 courses. Now, we started out in 2011 with only a handful of courses and a small teaching team that's now grown to 16 full-time academics and up to 30 sessional staff. In terms of our student profile, so 70% of our students would be recognised as belonging to an equity group, with 54% low SES, 9 ATSE, 21% regional remote. And we're very proud of our retention numbers. For those that do complete the program, 96% go into a bachelor program. And you can see the numbers there at the top overall. So we have about 1,500 students that come through the program. We know that by no means are we the largest across Australia, but we are the biggest in our state. You can see some little anecdotes there from students talking about the impact of our program. And just to do also a bit of a plug for some innovations and achievements of our teaching team here. As well as our programs that we run, we have a community outreach where we engage women who have been recently homeless or experienced domestic violence. And our team has been recognised through national awards. We have recognition for professional development in inclusive and enabling pedagogies that's aimed at upskilling sessional tutors who may have taught in higher ed and move over into the enabling space and really need some pedagogical skills and knowledge about engaging students from equity groups. We've also received national recognition for our work in academic integrity, and we received recognition with the Innovative Universities Award as well for our professional development initiative. So just to give a brief outline of those initiatives, so we have these inclusive and enabling pedagogy workshops that you can see there that we cover a whole range of topics. And we also run action research for our continuing staff. So again, this is about building a community of practice of enabling educators. And this has been really instrumental to adopting enabling pedagogies across our whole program. And so just before we hand over to our panel, I want to show you a 3-minute video which demonstrates the impact of the enabling programs here at UniSA College as we hear from our students.
I left school really young. I went to become a full-time chef so I could earn some money so I could be independent, and I worked I think about 55 hours a week for a really long time, and then just thought, this is not enough for me. I needed to do something different.
At school, I wasn't the grade A student. I saw all my friends achieving their goals around me, and I didn't have the right tools at the time to achieve those dreams of going to university, like becoming an architect. That's really what I wanted to do.
I was born in a very small village in Afghanistan. The education system wasn't really good, and it's not improved, it's not developed. I wanted to go to uni, but I couldn't because I didn't have money and I didn't have the opportunities.
I grew up in Fiji. There's not much opportunities there. I think moving here was a big opportunity for me and my siblings. I didn't get the amount of ATAR I wanted to get into the teaching course. So I thought maybe foundation is the right choice.
To be honest, I felt like I was never capable of going to university. Yeah, this year proved myself wrong.
So I found UniSA College and applied and got in and burst into tears. It was probably one of the best moments of my life, getting that email to tell me that I was in.
When I started UniSA, I was so nervous, like I don't know anyone. But then I started making friends. During my first class, I just went out, I was like, hi, I'm Fipe. And I just started making friends because I just wanted, to involve myself and be surrounded with people that will help you along this journey.
I have had one of the best experiences here. It's because the environment is very friendly, and I'm kind of learning more than I have learned back home. It's completely awesome. When it comes to UniSA, it's kind of, I feel it like home. I feel it my place.
Being 37, having 4 kids at home doesn't mean that you can't go to uni. It just means that you have to structure your life a little bit better, and uni helps you do that.
Where would I be without UniSA College? I feel that I would be still a landscaper. I think I'd struggle week to week financially like I was. I wouldn't be where I'm at now, which is a homeowner, a husband and a father.
Every time I think about it, I feel so proud of myself. Doing the foundation studies has been a big thing in my life. I know it's going to help me be a teacher, and then maybe I can give back to the people that helped me back in Fiji.
The foundation studies definitely helped me to begin my quest to get a degree in business management. The friends that I've made, I believe, are going to be friends for life. I just believe it's made me a better person.
It's kind of emotional because I never thought that I could be in this position, ever. I never thought that I could be studying at university. I came from a bit of a low-income background, so school was hard, and I never thought that I'd have the opportunity to go back to school and learn and grow and do something that's going to make so much of a difference in the world. The college changed my life 100%, and I don't know where I'd be without it.
Okay, so here we have amazing stories of our students, and I think that provides a lovely segue as we move into the next session, which is going to be an exploration of legislation and the impact that it potentially could have on the enabling space. So I would like to first introduce our panel chair, who is Dr. Nadine Zacharias, who is a Director of Student Engagement and an Associate Professor of Higher Education at Swinburne University of Technology. In that role, Nadine has responsibility for strategic retention programs and services. Nadine's research interests and expertise are at the intersection of equity research, practice and policy at institutional and national levels. She has led applied research projects in the fields of equity policy and program management, inclusive teaching and learning, and gender equity in employment. In 2016, Nadine was an inaugural Equity Fellow with the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, NAEEA, and with Matt Brett, she developed the Best Chances for All, a new vision statement for student equity in Australian tertiary education. So thank you very much, Nadine. I'd also like to introduce Professor Andrew Norton, who is a Professor in the Practice of Higher Education Policy at the Centre for Social Research and Methods at the Australian National University. He was previously the Higher Education Program Director at the Grattan Institute. Mr. Norton is the author or co-author of many articles, reports, and other publications on higher education topics. He also writes a blog on higher education issues, andrewnorton.net.au, and in 2013-14, he was the co-author of a government-commissioned review of the demand-driven student funding system. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us. And Associate Professor Deanna Grant-Smith is Deputy Director of the QUT Centre for Decent Work and Industry, and her research focuses on the intersection of unpaid work, work-integrated learning, and wellbeing. So thank you very much for joining us. Before we start our session and before I hand over, what we want to do is just poll our audience to see where they are seeking out and gaining their information about this legislation. So just wait while I launch our first poll. And I will give 30 seconds, 30 seconds for people to respond. So we're very interested to know where people are sourcing their information. And we think that this session will provide a fabulous opportunity for us to learn a lot more about what the impacts may be. We're almost there. Okay. So mostly at this point, it is media coverage, which is where we're getting our information. And then shared with the institution and the conversations with colleagues. Okay, so I will now hand over to you, Nadine. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. I am the chair of the session, and I really like to thank NAEEA for inviting me to chair this panel about the Job Ready Graduates package, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome my fellow panelists, Professor Andrew Norton and Associate Professor Deanna Grant-Smith. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with the group today. As the chair, I'd like to acknowledge country, and I know that this is a slightly tricky concept, in a webinar. To do that because we are all over the country. I'm on Wurundjeri country, so I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and their elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for their care of the land on which we live and reside today. The Job Ready Graduates package is quite a comprehensive piece of policy, and in many ways, in Andrew we have our resident expert who will pick apart the finer points of this policy package and how it relates to enabling education in particular. It's also a particular pleasure to have Deanna on this panel, because she might want to look out to whether this piece of policy can live up to its expectations of, you know, getting our graduates into the jobs market. So the way we're going to run this is there'll be brief presentations from Andrew, Deanna, and myself, and we're going to sketch some of the details of the legislation, knowing that in general colleagues are not particularly steeped into the policy detail and may not be, you know, like fully aware or systematically aware of what it might mean for your sector. Both Sally and Sharon yesterday spoke to the policy challenge that Job Ready Graduates presents particular to enabling educators, and already gave us some really useful questions that we can pursue today in this discussion in conversation with Andrew and Deanna. We'll focus, so Job Ready Graduates is a really broad package. As I said, it's quite comprehensive. We'll focus in on the EARLSEF, which is just one of the most gorgeous acronyms that they've come up with lately. So it is, EARLSEF stands for the Indigenous Regional Low SES Attainment Fund, and both the equity programs and the enabling loading are covered under that element of the legislation. I guess where I want to start before we, you know, contemplate the policy package is the context in which it is occurring, and that, of course, is COVID-19 and the onset of a global pandemic, which really has turned both the Australian higher education sector's financial model upside down and its operating model. So in a context where you know, like our borders, our international borders are closed, international students cannot enter the country, that has, of course, introduced a level of financial challenge to the university, to the university sector that runs into the billions. At the same time, our operating model of face-to-face delivery, of learning as a social process, that is still the predominant model for universities in Australia, has also been turned upside down. You know, like I have had the pleasure of 111 days in hard lockdown, and I can tell you that this is not an experience I wish on anybody. I haven't been on campus since the middle of March. I won't be back until at least the 1st of February. So, you know, like what that has meant for our academic colleagues, what it has meant for our students, is just a fundamental challenge to how we do higher education and how we do teaching. And that might come up in conversation again, you know. So I guess we need to be conscious that there is sort of a broader social and economic context for this discussion, and then within that nested is a quite comprehensive policy and legislative and funding change that is going to hit the sector from next year, and with its full force in 2024. And it amounts to a little bit of a perfect storm for the sector that we are facing at this particular point in time. What I'm going to share with you is, I'll remind you of a policy idea that my colleagues Matt Brett and I, with the very generous and competent support by Professor Sally Kift, developed 2 years ago, and that was developed in consultation with the sector through the Student Equity 2030 campaign that was supported by the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education. So I guess I'd just like to remind you of the Best Chance for All, which was a longer term vision for student equity in higher education for the Australian context, to say there was a good idea lying around and the government chose not to take it. But I think it is just important to remind ourselves of the alternatives and to use them as a reference point for what we're going to talk about for the remainder of this discussion, to say that there is actually an alternative, and we are not forever locked into this particular piece of policy. Hang on, and now bear with me. I've shared with the group that my university is a Teams university rather than a Zoom university. So Zoom always makes me slightly nervous. So here we are. This seems to have worked. So this is the best chance for all, and we set out to sketch the policy trajectory. You may know that Australia has a long history of equity policy in higher education. It started with a Fair Chance for All, which was released in 1990, and really provided the base level for many things we now take for granted. Australia is the only country that has a 25 plus year longitudinal data set on equity performance data. So we talk about the Martin indicators of access, retention, participation, success, completion. No other country has that longitudinal data set, and that is an amazing achievement. The next main piece of policy thinking was the Bradley Review in 2018, which led to the implementation of the demand-driven funding system from 2010 and the implementation of the HEP. And together, both Andrew's work and my own work have demonstrated that together, those two policy pieces shifted the dial on equity participation. We have broken the stagnant trend of participation by students from low SES background, by Indigenous students. Students with disability have totally overachieved. So together, those two bits of policy made a difference. So it can be done. And the policy tools are really important, and demand-driven funding was really important. So at the point of time, where we started this conversation, it was 2018, and we were very much looking out to what might higher education look like in 2030, and what does this mean for equity policy in Australia. So what we came up with is this vision statement, which is in the top left corner, and which, Sally gave us this tagline of the best chance for all, which was a brilliant piece of wordsmithing. So the definition that the sector came up with really was that Australia's future depends on all its people, whoever and wherever they are, being enabled to successfully engage in beneficial lifelong learning. Now, the core concepts which underpin this definition is one of universal access to tertiary education and of lifelong learning that has benefits, to the individual as well as to the nation more broadly. And I think the video that we've just seen speaks so loudly to the benefits, the individual benefits that accrue to students who participate in enabling programs. And we could have a similar video, about the life-changing impact that getting a higher education qualification has on students who participate. So those two concepts of universal access, whoever and wherever they are, and of lifelong learning, that the idea that university is not just something that you do, or formal education is not something you just do at a particular point in time when you leave high school, but that you have to dip in and out, that you have to come back multiple times throughout your life course to upskill, to reskill, to remain, fully engaged, both in employment, but also in civic life. That became a really important concept. The next slide sets this out a bit more. So we very much conceptualized tertiary education as a foundation, as foundational to creating a fair, democratic, prosperous and enterprising nation. And we took that definition at the time from the Monash Commission. Remember that one? So it is not that we didn't have, good, strong ideas that were in the sector at the time. It's just that, the government decided not to take them. We also said that education is absolutely fundamental to reconciliation with Indigenous Australia. And again, very slow progress in that space to date. And it is also fundamental to cultural, civic and intellectual life. I've just come out this morning, I chaired an internal conversation around how we achieve 100% will. So people may know that Swinburne is a very industry engaged university, and we have, under a new Vice Chancellor, really put our hand on our heart and say we want every single undergraduate student to participate, have an opportunity to participate in will experiences across their degree. So how do we make this happen? And I'm going to be interested in Deanna's take on this, but we are really struggling as an institution to say, yes, higher education, has a link to employment outcomes, but it also has very much this grounding in citizenship, you know, and it needs to speak to broader outcomes than just a job, than just a piece of paper at the end that gets you into the labor market. And so we are grappling with this at the moment, and we grappled with this as we you know, sort of pitched a policy vision to the sector. Then you get into the implementation bit, you know, of a big vision. So we thought about how can we achieve that broad vision of universal access and lifelong learning. So we need a system that is inclusively designed, that has multiple entry and exit points. So you can come in and out, you know, where you need to, and you can leave with a qualification that suits your current purpose. And not, you know, we're not necessarily there yet by any stretch. We talked about the proactive removal of barriers to participation. So how are we designing our courses? How are we designing our processes across universities to enable universal participation? And then finally, what are the cohorts, what are the students that still need tailored support, you know, to participate on a level playing field? That is the how-to, this is the implementation bit. And the third pillar of the vision was that we had a strong sense that we as a sector needed to be more accountable. More accountable for our outcomes, you know, so we really said we need an integrated approach to measuring success, and we need a broad definition of what success looks like. And again, this is particularly relevant in the enabling space, where, you know, like we talk about, is it credentialed? Should it be credentialed? Is it a portable, you know, is the outcome of the enabling program, is this portable? Does my enabling program enable students to get into a different institution? All of this, right? So what is success? What is a good outcome, and for whom? So we need an integrated, a holistic, a broadly defined way of measuring success at the institutional and national level that aligns performance with policy objectives. So how do we tie something like our access and equity plans to funding that comes in through something like the HEP or the ELSEF, right? So how do the two speak to each other? Currently, not very much. So that was the idea that we pitched. It very much went to the integration of vocational and higher education as a tertiary sector, so that, you know, movement right across the system was made easy, and that you come up with that, you know, seamless pathway of lifelong learning and universal access, and you can come in and out as you require by way of, you know, your own unique personal circumstance. So I guess where my dismay is that in the legislation, in the job ready graduates legislation, we go back to a language of equality of opportunity, which really takes us back into the 70s, right? And it takes us back into conversations around merit and privilege and competitive access to education. And it in my mind, and sort of in the light of the literature that is coming out in Australia and at the global level, including Sally found this fabulous reference to work done by UNESCO of the need to create education systems that support lifelong learning in quite individualized and flexible ways. So it absolutely flies in the face of this. There is an intent by the government to channel students into particular disciplines and programs. There is, you know, we are moving away from this idea of demand-driven funding, of, you know, where student interest and engagement is, you know, and we fund this accordingly. So what the job ready graduate package does is shift us away from those notions of universal access and lifelong learning. And I think therein lies its weakness. And I'm going to come back to that whole idea at the end of the session, because I got strongly instructed by Sarah and her colleagues to end us on a note of hope. And I'm going to come back to this whole idea of this piece of legislation really flies in the face of what global bodies tell us is required of education systems in the 21st century. And I think within that might lie the seed of its demise. But that is sort of my level of crystal ball gazing. Okay, I'm going to leave it here. And I guess as the chair, I have the power to take immediate comments. I'm just looking into the chat. Tanya, is there anything that you think I should respond to immediately, or do we go straight to Andrew? Really just endorsement. Look, I'm going to, put your questions into the chat, and I'm going to hand over to Andrew to walk us through the finer points of the Job Ready Graduates package, how it relates to the enabling space and to equity policy more broadly. Andrew, over to you.
So I just need to share screen, and here we go. Is it happening? Here we go. From beginning.
Yep.
Is that showing? Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me to this session. I think this might have been prompted by a blog post I wrote a few months ago on the fate of enabling courses under Job Ready Graduates. And I don't want to be melodramatic, but I think there is quite a serious problem with Job Ready Graduates and enabling courses. I'm not entirely sure why the government has taken the approach it has, but I have heard concerns, which Nadine alluded to, about are they accredited? They're not very standard. What do they lead to? So I think there is some government skepticism about them, and that's flowing into policy. So I just want to start with how enabling programs were funded really until this year. So there have been some changes this year already. So as you'd all know, there was no student contribution charged for enabling courses, but universities are partly compensated for that with an enabling loading. And this enabling loading is distributed largely based on historical allocation. So it's not based on criteria or performance or anything like that. It's generally the strongest predictor of how much enabling loading you get is how much you got the previous year. And in total, it was just over $30 million in 2019. Now, in nominal terms, the loading has been around $3,400. The average actually paid is been lower than that. So I estimated it was about $2,700 in 2018. The reason for that is there is a nominal number of enabling places given to each university with enabling funding, but many universities enroll more than that. And so that reduces the average value of the enabling loading. Now, in 2018, I had used that data to have a look at how much would universities get if they charge student contributions in those disciplines. And it averages a bit over $8,000. So even with the full enabling, universities are taking a large discount on what they would get for a student in a diploma or bachelor course. The other element of funding for enabling is that enabling students get the same, or the university receives on behalf of the enabling students, the same Commonwealth contribution linked to discipline as students in other courses. And until 2019, that came out of a pot of money shared with sub-bachelor courses. So there was no formal cap on enabling other than the overall funding cap with that shared pot of money with the sub-bachelor courses. Now, even though universities could make significantly more money by shifting their student load into sub-bachelor, as this enrolment trends chart shows, that really hasn't happened. There's been a bit of a dip for a couple of years there late last decade, but generally speaking, there's been pretty strong enrolment growth in enabling courses over time. Really suggesting that universities have seen value in this particular thing and seen value above and beyond what they're actually getting through the enabling loading. Now, 2020, this year, saw the first significant move against enabling places. And so a hard cap was put on Commonwealth grant schemes. That's the fund the Commonwealth contributions come out of for enabling places. So that previous flexibility to move places between enabling and sub-bachelor was removed. And as enabling loading is also capped, that effectively means that the students over your enabling loading amount get $0. So basically you're teaching them for free, and obviously in a very tough financial environment that causes problems for universities. Now, this is actually going strongly against the government's general approach. So previously, in recent years, there have been 3 pots of money: sub-bachelor, bachelor, and postgraduate. Job-ready graduates is going to abolish that entirely. It's sort of, there's a workaround for 2020 to ease that, so universities can move their places between the qualification levels as they choose. But with enabling, there's going to be a restriction. So universities can move funding out of enabling into sub-bachelor or bachelor if they choose to do that, but they can't move funding into enabling. So if you do move it, if a university does move it, under this, it's lost permanently. So again, it's almost encouraging universities to move their resources out of enabling and into other qualifications. As you'd all know from all the media coverage which you've reported in your poll, the Commonwealth contributions are going to go on average down in 2021. There is grandfathering for continuing students, so universities receive the old rates for continuing students in those fields where student contributions would go up. But I'd have to take advice from people in the audience on this, but my view is that given enabling courses are fairly short compared to, say, a bachelor degree, the grandfathering rates will be new, that most students will be new students in this program, and therefore enabling courses will move straight to the new job-ready graduates' Commonwealth contribution rates. My approximation, because the funding clusters don't entirely match, is that there'll be an average 17% cut in Commonwealth contributions received for enabling places. So this is obviously quite a significant problem for the universities. In the other courses, there is the loss in Commonwealth contribution will be at least partly compensated for by increases in student contributions. But of course, there are no student contributions in enabling courses. And so this is a much more serious cut for enabling than it is for the other qualification levels. The other issue I want to draw attention to, and I think this kind of explains a lot of the news coverage we're hearing at the moment about closure of courses at various universities, is we go back in history about how our funding system was designed. So 30 years ago, when the Dawkins mergers of colleges, advanced education universities happened, there was a rough costing model done, but it was never really intended to reliably fund at the discipline level or the course level. It was basically saying, we will fund you overall at the level required to meet your mission, and you work out how you want to cross-subsidize and all those kinds of details. What job-ready graduates does is say, basically, we've looked at, through a Deloitte study, the average cost per discipline across the sector, and we're basically going to give you an overall funding rate, that's the Commonwealth plus the student contribution, that matches that average cost. In my view, what this is doing is eliminating what I call the swings and roundabouts money. So basically, you make profits on some disciplines and you use those to support courses that are part of your mission, but aren't necessarily bringing enough revenue to be fully self-financing. And the chart was just my analysis of the sort of the fall in those of disciplines in making any kind of profit. And this chart is actually more optimistic because the ones that are making profits are making much lower profits than they did before. And so combine this with the loss of international student revenue, and I think the capacity to support courses that are not breaking even on their own has gone down. And for the reasons just outlined, due to the loss of the Commonwealth contribution money, enabling courses are going to be less self-financing in future than they were under the old system. Nadine has already mentioned the ELSAF, a very ugly acronym. Now, the underlying Indigenous Regional Enabling and funds are going to be continued in the ELSAF for the next few years. But the HEP funding formula, which I think is a guide to where it's going to go in ELSAF more broadly, will be reorientated towards regional and Indigenous students. I don't think that's inherently problematic to be looking at regional Indigenous participation where there are clear problems, but it does mean that generally speaking, universities in metropolitan areas will get less. In fact, they'll put more in from their existing HEP and enabling loading than they will get out again. And so that's a further layer of problems. Now, I'm not quite clear how ELSAF is going to work over the long run. I think there is perhaps a slightly optimistic, slightly optimistic scenario which says that ELSAF will be more flexible. So, for example, a university could decide to put more of its broad equity resources into enabling, but that may not happen given the government is generally hostile to enabling programs. That may be blocked. The other problem is that ELSAF is for equity students, that is students in the official equity categories, while enabling programs have broader objectives. So I think we saw in the Uni SA example that about 30% of the students didn't fall into any enabling group. So they might have some personal disadvantage, but they're not meeting the official equity group criteria. And that's sort of reflected in the national data as well, that it's a bit hard to work out what's going on because people can be in multiple categories, but pretty clearly a substantial minority of current enabling students do not meet equity criteria, and therefore there's a question about whether any ELSAF money can be spent on them. And so that creates serious problems for enabling courses meeting all their objectives. Now, I think there might be a couple of partial, not entirely satisfactory workarounds, but are worth thinking about. One is that there's this new undergraduate certificate, which is basically half a diploma or diplomas. There is now more flexibility under job-ready graduates to move resources to the diploma level. You can set a student contribution at 0 or a very low rate, but putting students in these courses would at least mean a Commonwealth contribution could be paid. We know there'd be high attrition from this given the nature of the enabling cohort, but sub-bachelor attrition is not currently counted towards performance funding, so that would ease some university concerns. But there are a couple of other things that TEXA rules on courses and admissions apply to any kind of undergraduate certificate or diploma, and therefore, for example, an open access course would not be permissible under these rules. So that could be a constraint. It might work for some existing enabling programs, but not for all of them. And undergraduate certificates are only on the Australian qualifications framework officially until the end of this year. So an open question about whether they will continue or not. The other workaround, which I think would be pretty unattractive in the equity space, is you can offer full fee enabling programs funded through the Fee Help Loan Scheme. There are some in the system already, but I suspect this is probably more suited to students who are not really equity students, but have some academic weakness they need to remedy before moving on with their studies. Just want to finish with a brief discussion of the issue of places, which Nadine alluded to with the end of the demand-driven system a few years ago. So as you can see, we are headed for a very big increase in the birth size of the birth cohort, which will start arriving university age in about 2025. On my estimates, even if we maintain school leaver participation rates in university, roughly their current levels, sort of around 40-41%, we're looking at additional 20,000 commencing or would-be commencing students each year. And so that's actually quite a lot. It's kind of a medium-sized university on its own. And so the big question is, how are we going to deal with this? Now, the government has put out various charts showing its estimates of student places into the future. I really don't know how they've arrived at these numbers. Even over the very short term, I can't replicate them. It's working on very big assumptions. One key thing to note is that in the lead up to 2025, we've actually got lower Commonwealth Grant Scheme funds listed in the budget than would have happened under the previous systems. That's a pretty bad start. There are two main mechanisms by which places might grow. One is that the average Commonwealth contribution generally, as well as for enabling, goes down. So effectively for each $1 million on average, universities need to deliver more places. The big problem with that is that job-ready graduates creates a huge range in Commonwealth contributions, from only $1,100 for business, law, and most arts to $27,000 for agriculture or medicine. And so obviously, which discipline you take students in has a huge effect on your average. And so the great paradox or irony or contradiction of job-ready graduates is the extent that enrolments shift to the official job-ready fields or the favoured fields, the average Commonwealth contribution in many of those fields is higher than now. So you actually get fewer places for each $1 million. The other way that places might grow is that in those $1,100 fields, law, arts, and business, there's a $14,500 student contribution. Now, there's some speculation as to whether that will impact demand, but from the university point of view, it's probably feasible to offer a fair range of courses on the 14,500 alone. And therefore, we might get what I've been calling a de facto demand-driven system in those fields if there is actual student demand for them. And so that could be a significant growth mechanism. But this is all really pretty speculative and is making some big assumptions about both the discipline level nature of demand into the future and how universities will respond to the new incentives. One reason I'm particularly concerned about a contraction in, if there's not an absolute contraction in student places, a drop relative to demand, is that we know from history that low SES students are more sensitive at the margins to what's going on. So in the early part of this decade, so this is looking at commencing students with a base of 1 in 2001. So you can see in the early part of this century, where then Minister Brendan Nelson then threatened to legislate and then did legislate, basically to penalise universities for so-called over-enrolments. And so universities hauled back on their commencing student numbers, but you can see that affected low SES slightly more than other SES students. And then with the demand-driven system that Nadine has talked about, we saw the low SES commencing students grow more quickly than other SES students. And I think the reason for this, or probably multiple reasons, but a key reason, this is my last slide, is really the nature of the prior academic performance across the SES spectrum. So what this chart is showing, for each ATAR decile, what percentage of all the students, all the year 12s in New South Wales in 2017 got that, were in that ATAR. And you can see that basically the high SES students dominate the top ATARs and the low SES students dominate the lower ATARs. And due to the effects of academic selection, at the margins, when supply exceeds demand, the ATARs go up. And that means at the margins, the low SES students are going to be disadvantaged by this scheme, or by an imbalance between supply and demand. One of the reasons we don't see the growth in a higher SES is that at the higher ATAR levels, we're maxed out with participation rates, and only demographic change actually alters the student numbers. This slide really explains why we need the demand-driven system. It's the only system that will automatically adjust to changes in demography without relying on political decisions and without making big assumptions about how universities might respond to the complex financial incentives of government policy. So thank you. I will end there.
Thank you so much, Andrew. This is fascinating, and it just reinforces the point of what is at stake here with this legislation. Thank you. Any immediate questions of Andrew? None in the chat so far. Only comments. Okay, we'll come to the comments later if we've got a bit of time. So I'm going to hand over to Deanna for really a bit of an evidence-informed crystal ball gaze of whether this legislation might, live up to its promise of producing job-ready graduates and enabling successful transitions into an increasingly complicated labour market. Deanna, over to you.
Thank you, Nadine. I guess I'll start by saying the fundamental premise of the fact that they need to create legislation for job-ready graduates, for me, is problematic. It is so deficit-focused. It assumes that the graduates that we're delivering now aren't job-ready. There's a lovely piece of work that was done in the UK that says that what industry is looking for is graduates who are self-basting and oven-ready. So it really gives the impression that they don't want to have to do anything for graduates when they leave, that we're meant to provide them with absolutely everything that they require, not just to succeed in the graduate job market, but to actually enter the job market at a higher level than that. We've seen an enormous contraction in the amount of graduate jobs that are available. And we believe that part of this contraction is probably as a result of the increasing push towards work integrated learning. So yes, Nadine, I will answer that question. We are seeing that the Job Ready Graduates legislation is increasing that focus on work integrated learning, on placements, and on industry experience. Our concern is that the National Priorities and Industry Linkage Fund, which is related to this legislation, seems to be putting all of its eggs in the work placement basket, and that a lot of this funding will probably go to industry to support their involvement. For me, this is quite problematic because research that we've done suggests that participation in extended periods of unpaid work experience, which is typically what we're looking at here with WIL, can have really significant financial, psychosocial, and academic impacts on the well-being of students that really we're not equipped to be dealing with. There's very little recognition of the impact on students of this increasing focus on WIL. Basically, what is suggested is that WIL will be the difference between a student being employable or not. But really what this legislation does is it neglects the broader labour market concerns that we have, that a student can be highly employable. They can be absolutely job ready, but they can still be unemployed. So most of the work that has gone into the Job Ready Graduates program has failed to recognise the importance of industry in reshaping labour markets to take on graduates, because there are no jobs for the graduates when they come out. The other concern we have is if universities like QUT, like Swinburne, probably like every single university in the country, is really emphasising 100% participation in WIL, this will no longer be something that students can use to demonstrate competitive advantage. It becomes the new baseline that every single student needs to have. So our research shows that as unpaid work and increasingly extended periods of unpaid work becomes the norm within the higher education sector, that students are electing outside of the safety of higher education to undertake unpaid work as well. So some of this is illegal unpaid work, but they're so eager to get a foothold into the labour market that they're quite willing to do this. We found that even in institutions that have work integrated learning that is sanctioned by the university, that there can be high levels of exploitation of the students. So I've interviewed students who weren't being paid, but the work that they were producing, the productive work for an organisation, was being charged out to clients. I have interviewed people where in order to get an unpaid work placement opportunity, which was a hurdle requirement of their degree to graduate, they were approaching more than 60 employers and not getting any bites. So we can already see that the industry is flooded with students who are willing to work for free to get experience. They're becoming more pressured by university institutions to create relationships with them to take our students. And I really think that the system is being flooded by this, and that it's probably not sustainable into the future to continue with doing that. The legislation doesn't provide much in the way of providing additional funding to attend to the financial, social, academic, and psychological well-being of students. So what we do know is that as WIL increases, the number of students who are approaching universities for support around those measures also increases. But most universities don't have the capacity to absorb that. So we're finding that there are very long waiting periods for students to access counselling, that there's very long waiting periods for them to access additional financial support, and that we're also seeing a very high level of demand for access to systems like food banks that some universities provide, which signals to us that the financial stress that these students are under is quite significant. I have interviewed academics who have had students come to their offices in tears because all they've been living on is 2-minute noodles for the 6 weeks of their placement. That typically with extended periods of placement, they can't engage in the normal work that they would have to sustain them during those periods. So what we see here again is that, as Andrew mentioned, it's these low SES students that are more sensitive to these changes because they are the ones who are more likely to have to work to support themselves while they're at university. The other thing that we found is that it's not students who are in receipt of government benefits who are most impacted because their income remains steady because they continue to receive the government benefits, but instead it's those students from a low SES background who are self-supporting, which means that it is non-traditional students. It is many of those older students who are working part-time and have families who are really negatively impacted by this increasing shift towards work integrated learning. We are also concerned that this push toward work integrated learning is focusing on the benefits to industry rather than on the benefits to the community, which goes back to Nadine's comment about citizenship being one of the values and one of the core outcomes of participation in higher education. So rather than being an absolute downer, I wanted to share with you some examples of what some institutions are doing that meet the WIL mandate while also meeting the kind of social obligation that we believe professionals should have, and which try to attend to the negative wellbeing impacts on students from participation. And the example that I wanted to share with you was the Australian National Tax Clinic program that is operated in a number of universities for financial planning and accounting students. And basically what they've done is set up a clinic where students are providing the equivalent of pro bono financial advice to other students or to low-income members of the community under supervision. So not only are they developing their professional skills in a well-supervised environment, they're also giving back to their fellow students and their community, and it's also engendering in them a sense of the value of pro bono work. So we think that there probably needs to be a recognition that service learning is a legitimate form of work integrated learning that is possibly something we should be progressing more than we have been in the past. We also think that if the government is keen on increasing the amount of students engaging in WIL in industry workplaces, that we need to be providing more oversight of those workplaces and more training for the people within the workplaces. As educators, we're trained to educate students. Work integrated learning under the Fair Work Act must have a learning outcome. They're not there just to do productive work, but the people that are supervising them aren't necessarily well appraised of what those learning outcomes should be or how they could enable them. So it requires a fundamental shift, both from the side of students and universities and the industry employers, of what the actual purpose of WIL is. We also are concerned that this push toward will also has the potential to be negative for some other equity groups as well. So research that's been done by Denise Jackson at, I think she's at Edith Cowan University, shows that international students or students from a non-English speaking background find accessing will much more difficult than other students, that many employers don't want to take them because they believe that their English language skills will not be sufficient. So it's very difficult for them to get places as well. So we believe that there should be some provisions for the recognition of prior work, and also some provisions for perhaps allowing students to conduct their work integrated learning in their home countries. Because if we look at the idea of employability, which is what the Job Ready Graduates legislation is pushing, one of the things you're meant to develop is not just exposure to the world of work or a bunch of hard skills and knowledges, but it's also networks. It's also being able to operate within that work environment. So if we're not giving them the opportunity to move into those work environments where they're likely to be working, it's unlikely to deliver all of the benefits that work integrated learning should be delivering. Now, finally, the last thing that I wanted to mention was it's about the redesign of the funding clusters and the bands and increasing participation in areas of national priority. Our concern is that this is really the government deciding what those industry areas of priority are. It's not demand driven, but industry is also not in the best position to determine what those are either, and they have a greater access of voice to government. We think that if industry believes that there's a problem of access of graduates to their industry, that perhaps they need to turn the gaze on themselves. Perhaps they need to be looking at the loss of things like paid cadetships or indentured internships, where they're actually capturing students early, paying them to do their studies, and then are guaranteeing them a position when they finish. We also think that it's beholden on them to start looking at their work conditions and find out, why don't students want to come to their industry? Is it racist? Is it misogynist? Is it dangerous? Is there some other reason that that demand just isn't there? And then finally, my last point is that I'm very concerned that this is going to create an artificial demand for courses, and that the unintended consequence of this will be a glut of graduates that can't be absorbed by industry within those specific disciplines. And the example that I will give you is urban and regional planning. So in the early 2000s, there were not enough planners. So planners were being poached in their first or second year of university. They were being paid for their practicum. At the minute that they arrived in an organisation, they were getting bonuses. Government found it incredibly difficult, particularly in urban areas, to attract them. Now, in my small corner of Southeast Queensland, there are 6 universities that are offering undergraduate planning degrees for an industry that in all of Australia, there are only 14,300 practicing planners. Yet we have 6 universities just here churning out graduate planners, and now there's a glut of them on the market. So my concern is that a lot of the industry demand is really focused on the short term, and that it's not tenable into the future. So thank you for my rant.
And what a good rant it was. Thank you so much for this, Diana. My immediate question that I have of you, and I'll start with you before going into the questions that Tanya has been collating for us, is what would good policy look like in this space? So if we are concerned about, the transitions to employment and into the workforce by our graduates and their preparedness to enter the workforce, what would good policy look like that could encourage this?
Okay, I think the policy needs to focus outside higher education as well. I think there needs to be a tightening of the Fair Work Act, which prevents people undertaking exploitative unpaid work, which is not illegal. And I think that we need to educate our students a bit more of that. But I also think that one of the things that needs to happen is that professional associations need to be helping the industry understand how the transferable skills that our students already have can be translated to their industry. So we know that most students undertake some form of part-time work, which demonstrates many of the skills that industry claims our graduates don't have. Teamwork skills, soft skills, interpersonal skills. These are all evident working at McDonald's or in a supermarket, but our students don't have the skills and confidence to translate that into something that would be attractive to a professional employer. And I think our professional employers, because there are so many graduates at the moment, can make demands like you need 2 years experience for a graduate job. So I think that we need to be reshaping industry expectations, but also helping students to recognize that they do have skills.
Yeah. Look, it's people may know I am German by origin, and the lack of engagement of employers in the education training system in Australia continues to baffle me. This is my particular rant, and I'm the chair, so you will have to indulge me. In Germany, the equivalent of the AQF is flipped. So here the AQF is hierarchical, right? You start in school, you go into the vocational sector, and then you go into the higher education sectors, and the bands go up, right? In Germany, it's flipped. So you can achieve, mastery, at the level of a bachelor or master's qualification through university, through your particular trade, through health schools, through art schools, through, so you have a variety of streams that you can use to achieve mastery of in your profession. So for example, for like a plumber would start with an apprenticeship in plumbing, and then they have to go back to formal education to become a master plumber before they can set up their own business, train their own apprentices, so there's a requalification at a formal level to achieve mastery in your profession, in your discipline. And that just doesn't happen here. And it has always baffled me. And every time, like that I raise this point in public conversation, it gets shut down because it's like, well, this is just not what we do here, and the Brits don't do it either, so there's no way we're ever going to go there, right? But it is like a serious limitation of the tertiary education system that we don't bring employers in more than we do.
Well, we used to, in fields like education and nursing, they were the equivalent, well, we could call it like an apprenticeship, where they were indentured, they worked while they studied, they had a job at the end. And it meant that the skills that they were developing and the knowledge were all intertwined. But most of those feminized different occupations, that doesn't happen anymore. And those are the occupations where I have seen the greatest level of stress of students in participating in this will.
Yeah. Andrew, before I hand over to the audience, any comments or questions you have in light of Deanna's presentation in particular?
I guess maybe the only thing I'd talk about is the oversupply issue. So I actually don't think these student contribution incentives will have a big impact on student choices. I think most of the research suggests that people form their views about what to study based on other things. And to the extent that it's financial, they are broadly observing what's going on in the labour market. And we do see, at least for the well-known occupations, we do see applications go up and down in line with what is perceived to be happening in the labour market. And so nothing that government will do to lower prices will actually override these bigger factors. Like whether you'll get a job at the end is much more important than whether you have to repay less money over the next 10 years. It's right. Yeah, and if you're just looking at the basic financial considerations without taking anything else into account, the student contribution reductions, you have to pay people a whole lot of money to actually change their financial incentives. And obviously that's
which is what they have sometimes tried in the past with incentives for education or nursing.
Yeah, it is. And sort of you had the old scholarships that actually paid you. It's kind of, discounting is not enough. It has to be something more immediate and valuable to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Andrew, a point of clarification I meant to ask you before I handed over to Deanna and forgot. With regard to the enabling loading, is this also something that will be phased in and take full effect in 2024, or will the full force of that be felt next year?
No, it's being phased in. So my understanding is it'll be the same as it was this year, plus a bit of indexation for next year. But how exactly everything's blurred in 2024, I don't think there's actually any clarity from the government on this yet, at least none that I've seen.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Have you done any, can I ask a question of Andrew, Nadine?
Go for it.
Have you done any work looking at the National Priorities and Industry Linkage Fund and what you think the impact of that will be?
Not a lot. I guess I was taking an optimistic view that unis could just rebrand stuff they're already doing as compliant with it, and it wouldn't necessarily mean very much. But it's kind of the difficulty with it. It's just creating less flexibility. Effectively, they're funding this by pulling money out of the Commonwealth grant scheme. And basically, it means that to do this, if it is rebranding, it's reducing effectively the number of places offered in the future. And given the trade-offs we're making, I would think there are sufficient existing things happening on the wool front that this will happen on its own. And given the big demographic issues we've got coming in mid-decade, to me, everything should be thrown into making sure there are enough places in 2025 and the coming years after that to ensure that the number of students or number of would-be students missing out is kept as low as we possibly can.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Tanya, over to our questions. You have been collating them for us. Here we go. All right. How can significant increases in will be addressed by universities to counter this being another barrier or deficit for students from equity groups who already face structural inequalities in the university environment? Jenna, I give this to you in the first instance.
Okay. How long is a piece of string? This is something I don't really have an answer to, because all we've seen is more and more and more, and students moving outside higher education if they feel they don't have enough. So when I first started researching in this space, typically what we found, and I'll use a degree like planning, was that will was what students who were less academically inclined did. So you were typically given a choice of doing in your fourth year an honours project if you were high performing, and will if you were not high performing. But we've really seen a shift where will is what everybody believes they need now, and I think the horse is bolted on that one.
Yeah, so does it now become a matter of how do we enable students from equity background to participate in good quality will opportunities?
Absolutely it does, and through the provision of those support services, making sure we have enough staff to be managing those processes. My concern is that with the loss of professional staff in most institutions through the recent cuts, is that we won't have staff to do that. So it will push a lot of the burden back onto students to find their own places, to manage them, and that will make them less well supervised and more potentially exploitative for students. So yeah, we just have to do what we're doing well.
Yeah. When I was still at Deakin, we had a program that paid students who lost their part-time employment while they were on placement, and it was an amazing program. 100% retention rate. We gave them sort of a before and after little workshop. So the do's and don'ts, of being in a workplace. And one of it was face to face, right? And one of the things we did was say, come in your best outfit. And it was fabulous because we had a young woman who showed up, like you would on a Friday night in your best outfit, right? And you have these opportunities to debrief, context and what, might go in one space might not go so much in a workplace. And we also brought them back at the end so that they could write up their experience for their LinkedIn profile, for their CV, which also was a really important piece of, cultural capacity building. So there's certainly really good stuff that we can do, including with equity funding, right, which we still have. In that space to make it possible. And I know certainly in my institution, these are the very questions we discussed this morning. So they are live conversations, at least in most institutions.
One of the things have been advocating is that when that kind of training occurs, is that we also spend time appraising students of their rights and responsibilities in the workplace. So we often focus on the responsibilities, but not on the rights, so that they can protect themselves. And most of them are unaware of what are illegal practices.
Yeah. Super. Here's another one on will. So this goes to the recognition of prior learning. Do you think this provision could be extended to mature age students in regional and or remote Australia?
Absolutely, I do believe that. One of the things I found through my research is that often if a student is already employed by an employer for the period of their work integrated learning, they will not be paid for that work, even if that was the work that they were doing before. So the employers are using that as an opportunity to save wages. So I would like to see that not be possible as well.
Yeah, I think the really important research piece that is in this, and you may have done some of this work, is do students actually obtain better jobs post-qualification? So those students who came into higher education employed, you know, does it lift their labour market outcomes to have completed a qualification? You know?
The answer to that is yes, but the answer to whether or not participation in will improves employment outcomes is less obvious. It's very disciplinary dependent and job market dependent. There is no firm answer for that.
Yeah, interesting. Because this is also interesting for the enabling cohort. You know, does it make a difference to their employment outcomes?
Yes.
Yeah. Enabling programs have been undertaken for some time. Birmingham attempted to introduce a fee-paying change, but the move was fortunately rejected. Yeah, I remember that particular crisis. Current arrangements exist until 2024. LSEF further muddies the waters. Dentian recently professed a commitment to equity in a radio interview, but what support do enabling programs actually have from the federal government? Andrew.
Yeah. So enabling programs are still in the legislation for funding under the Commonwealth Grant Scheme. So that's one thing they do have, but as I said, at lower rates than previously. And I'm assuming they will be fundable under LSAF, but we've got this issue about whether non-equity students will be able to receive any of the funding which is committed under the LSAF program. So they have some, but clearly the government, for whatever reason, has decided that they're not big on enabling programs, and therefore they have made life significantly more difficult without clearly explaining exactly why and what might get them to change their minds, whether some kind of more standardized enabling system might make them, you know, which is, you know, partially or regulated by TEXA, for example, whether that might satisfy them. But because they haven't really clearly articulated what the problem is, it's hard to say what the solution should be.
Yeah. Two things as follow-up. One was Sharon King, who I assume is in the session today, and she may be able to unmute herself, speculated yesterday, you know, that it might be about, you know, like it being free, the program being free to students, and there sort of to be an ideological objection, you know, from a Liberal government that you can still do university for free.
I think they would have gone for student contributions over abolition, though, if that was the main agenda, like Birmingham did, for example, with paying. So, look, I guess the free aspect probably does contribute to sort of the high attrition, because you've got no incentive to say, well, the census date is coming up, I better drop this. But obviously, I think from the research Tim Pittman and others have done shows that free is, particularly I think for the students who are really not sure whether higher ed is for them, I think the free is important. As I said in my presentation, there are others, for example, who just feel like they need more support in some particular discipline area, but are actually quite committed to higher ed. They may well be willing to pay. I think they probably would be.
Yeah. And the follow-up that I had from when you raised this point earlier around, you know, will universities be able to draw on the HEP under the new LSAF to support students in enabling programs? I know that this is currently going on, you know, like in various universities, that the support services to enabling students are part funded by HEP. So it's certainly current practice. And I guess it's a broader question. Do you think that the department, that the government will clamp down on their, you know, oversight of where HEP monies get spent, and put stronger, you know, brackets around that money?
The general philosophy on these sort of grouped funds is flexibility. So I kind of hope not. And in some ways, I think the way around this is to really show if we're trying to get people through the system, the equity students in particular, we have to focus on what are the obstacles currently stopping them from doing that. And clearly academic preparation is one of the big obstacles.
Yeah.
And so from that point of view, I think enabling is a sensible program. And as sort of my report on dropping out a couple of years ago, I said, I actually think there is always going to be a lot of trial and error in higher ed, that people, until you try something, often you really don't know whether it's for you or not. And from that point of view, I'm not particularly troubled by high attrition, as long as it happens fairly early on, and to limit the time and money cost of it to both the student and the university.
Yeah.
But if you try higher ed for a month and it really isn't for you, I think that's fine. That should not be regarded as a policy failure.
I agree with you on that one. Okay, so this is looking into the future. How will the new policy settings change the landscape of enabling courses across the sector? Will we see more specialization of universities offering enabling courses? And I guess this is, those who are already doing it, like, will there be less of them, but it becomes sort of a specialization for them?
I guess the problem is the one I articulated in the presentation, that it's fine to have a specialization, but can you sustain it financially? And I guess that would be where I'd be most nervous. I think from sort of the very heavy over enrollments in some universities, that maybe some of them regard this maybe as a bit of a loss leader, that it's worth spending a few $1,000s at the start, albeit not funded, to ensure you get the student who is then there for 3 years if all goes well. And so maybe that is the philosophy that they will take around it. But I just think this has made the whole thing much, much more difficult for universities to sustain. Sort of the twin hits of job-ready graduates and the international student travel ban really is, to me, just undermined sort of the way universities have operated, which is not to expect everything to be self-financing, even though the university as a whole has to, balance the budget.
Yeah, it is this, isn't it? And maybe our colleagues from UniSA may want to talk to this, but I know that, like in places like the University of Newcastle with very big enabling programs, like a sizable proportion of the undergraduate cohort is drawn from enabling programs, so I think in those spaces, you might take the loss leader strategy. UniSA is probably in a similar boat, but I think places that have smaller enabling programs will be hard pressed to sustain them. Yeah. This goes to so this goes to the question around educational disadvantage, and Andrew, it speaks, like to the point you raised around equity students. Not all participants in enabling programs are from equity groups, and so the minister in a Senate discussion, like opened up that idea of educational disadvantage. So if students experience this, then they would be could be funded. Again, conversation from yesterday was that we don't have clear definitions of what educational disadvantage constitutes. So the question here is, how do we define it? What are the definitions we already have available to us? What process could we put in place to achieve an agreed definition for the sector? Thoughts on that?
It's a difficult one. So this is partly goes to the vagueness of the TEXA rules, where you're not supposed to admit someone if they're not academically prepared, but no one really says what academic preparation is. So in the Grattan work, we really framed this through risk. Do people with certain characteristics in practice have very high rates of attrition or non-completion? And if they do, I class that as educational disadvantage. And so always I think the people who've got massive risk, very low chance of success, should not be admitted in the first place, because basically you're selling them an unethical product that's not going to benefit them. But there's a lot of people in that mid-range where maybe we've seen historic success, around 50-50. There, I think the only way to really test it is to put them in an academic environment, but possibly potentially in an enabling course first, and just to hit on the head possibly some relatively easy things to fix in a few months that will put them on the right track. So these are people who are, reasonably intelligent, but they have not had the prior academic preparation that means they can convert that intelligence into the kind of work that is assessed in a university environment.
Yeah, look, it is. I find it really fascinating. Many universities in Victoria have not had invigilated exams as our final assessment this year. And what we have seen in terms of success rates for equity students, I've now seen it in a couple of institutions, is quite extraordinary. So we have several percentage points better success rates achieved through alternative assessment mechanisms mainly than we have seen previously. So I really take your point that it is about setting students up for success, but it's also about, like, what do we do in-house, like how do we assess in particular student progress when they get there, and what difference does that make to the outcomes of equity group students?
Yeah. Incidentally, I think one of the big outcomes of that project was the importance of the census date in Australia. So most countries do not have, either have no period sort of try before you buy, or it's much shorter than the 4 weeks or 3-4 weeks you typically have. And I think that is a great institution. Wasn't set up to do this, but in practice, it's a great institution. There's a whole lot of people have a low risk experiment with higher ed.
Yeah.
Some don't continue, that's fine, but it probably means we get more into the system than we would where there were high risks where you're immediately liable for all the student contribution.
Yeah. Again, funny real life story. Based on the back of your report, of the dropping out report, we have actually run campaigns at Swinburne about census date, and we called it Reflection Week. And the feedback that we got from the first 2 semesters of running Reflection Week is that students thought it would be something to do with Indigenous reconciliation. Okay. So entirely missed the point. So we're back to the drawing board, about Reflection Week and sort of pushing the point. So we are now going to census date means payment date. But our marketing colleagues are not super convinced that this is the way to go.
That was just a Grattan meeting that decided on payment date, so it certainly needs more testing than that.
Yeah. But so suffice to say, Reflection Week didn't really do it, right? So we tried gentle and it really backfired.
Another question about...
Yeah, for you.
So this is a reference to why, when we did that demand-driven review 7 or 8 years ago, we did not recommend putting enabling places into the demand-driven system. And part of the reason was that they had none of the constraints that were there otherwise. So the context for this is some concern about out of control growth in demand-driven funding. So the government was concerned about that. And the difficulty with enabling was that some of the barriers to out of control growth in the other parts of the system, such as the students have to pay, or TEXA is regulating the quality, simply weren't there for enabling courses. And so we thought they were perhaps at higher risk of things not being done entirely as they should be. But now that I'm sort of clearer that for the universities, there are very clear financial trade-offs, like disadvantages in taking enabling students over sub-bachelor, I think given the financial disadvantage to the university, they wouldn't be doing this unless they thought this was the right product for the student, where the student was at that point. And so I think there are these more natural barriers from the funding perspective than I perhaps was fully thinking about at the time, where we had a lot of other issues and maybe this didn't get thought through enough. But I'm more convinced now that we could safely uncap this, because there is still a trade-off for universities, and my view is that they won't do this unless there are good reasons. And you can still monitor this. Like, if a university has 99% non-completion, there should be red flags about that. There is something seriously wrong.
Yeah, that sounds sensible.
Yeah.
Good. We have 10 minutes left. There's another one. But colleagues, because I'm sort of looking into the chat. So colleagues, if you have any further questions, please, now is your moment. But we do have another one. Okay, how should NAEEA and individual institutions with large enabling programs use the next 3 years, so out to 2024, to demonstrate the value of enabling education to the higher education sector, the economy, and individual students?
That's tough. I guess the video you showed early on is a pretty good example of real life stories that explain what this means. So I think there's pretty low awareness of enabling courses compared to other courses at universities, since that is an issue. if you said enabling courses are good to many people, they'd say, what is an enabling course? So that's one problem. But I think, putting out a report or two which demonstrates the success of some of these things and the risks that they want to continue into the future, I think that would be valuable stuff. And particularly while the details of LSAF are still being worked out. So I think it's very, very important that LSAF money can be used for enabling. And it's probably important that there be some flexibility over which students can receive it. Like, this is a broader problem that the official equity categories, as we all know, include some students who don't need any help and admit a whole lot of students who do need help. And so they're not very good for allocating benefits to individual persons.
Yeah, I also think, back to your original point, I think it would be really useful for NAEEA and for institutions, to do an analysis of their student profile so that, like UniSA demonstrated, in their introductory slides, you have a really firm idea of how many students could be covered by equity funding and what the gap is that you might, have to cater to. And it is, I guess, it is about sort of the long-term benefits, to the students and, how many go on, how well do they do, what happens next, how do they transition into the workplace? I think that work would also be really powerful if NAEEA could demonstrate that.
Yeah, I think that longitudinal aspect, given their focus on job ready, is imperative. It's not just entry into higher ed, but it's what happens at the other end. And they wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the enabling.
Exactly. And I think this is the other bit, and it came up yesterday again, that the vast majority of students who were surveyed said they wouldn't have participated in the program if it had been fee paying. So I think that distinction that Andrew has spoken to multiple times today as well, yes, there are those students who will, even if it is fee paying, but the vast majority of students will not. And then what do we lose, like as a sector, as a nation, as an economy, what are the costs of this offering collapsing? What is at stake? Tanya, do we have any further questions?
There is just one for Deanna. If you could share any examples of will in enabling programs, as they are usually shorter in length, and also the intentional focus as the next step is more educative rather than work.
Yeah, I don't have any specific examples of will in enabling programs other than one of the ways that they often communicate value to students and make the link between theory is through practice. So they'll often link it to industry examples. So enabling courses that are targeting students who are going into business, for example, will often use business case studies as a way of providing that knowledge and link so that they could see not just how they could use this in university, but what the outcome could be at the end. So tying it to things that they already know in their life so that they can understand that higher education could be for them. That's the only example I've seen.
Fantastic, thank you. And there's just one also from George a bit earlier. Will the new IRLSAF funding be used instead to fund alternative English language programs to prepare students for uni? And is this funding heading for private providers? Any thoughts around that?
Look, I don't know what LSAF will fund, but I'd be surprised if it was basic English proficiency. It might be essay writing and use of English, but I think that's probably a different kind of category of work.
The guidelines that have been published, the other grant guidelines 2020 version that have been published by the department to guide the LSAF is still, broadly in line with the HEP guidelines. The biggest change in the language is around equality of opportunity. So they have introduced that language of equality of opportunity, which just gave me the shivers because it goes back to a previous era and really in entirely the wrong direction. But it speaks to that, a recapping of places, at least, notwithstanding, what Andrew has said about universities' ability to run a demand-driven funding system in some courses, but, at least in principle, a move away from demand-driven funding and sort of back to ideas of merit and innate talent is really concerning to me, at least. Okay, we have 6 minutes left, so I'll give both Andrew and Deanna an opportunity for final thoughts before I wrap up the session. Deanna, to you in the first instance, concluding thoughts.
I think that with most of this, the devil is going to be in the detail and the way the institutions themselves decide to implement this. One of my concerns is that research-intensive institutions have always used teaching as a way of cross-funding, and I would be concerned if that happened too much when there's a decreasing funding pool.
Yeah. And what will happen to research, is an entirely different question, and we could spend another 90 minutes talking about that.
It has its own challenges.
Correct. Thank you. Andrew, concluding remarks.
Yeah. Just to finish on an optimistic note, if you look through the history of higher ed policy, there have been many periods of bad policy, but ultimately it tends to correct itself. Even though there might be a period of lower participation in the mid-2020s, history shows that in the long run, here and in every other country, regardless of funding system, ways are found to bring it back up again, because I think there's been fundamental social, cultural, economic changes that mean that people do want higher education, and ultimately the political systems do respond to that demand. So I think we're headed for a very rough few years, but I'm reasonably confident that sanity will be restored.
Wonderful. And I completely echo Andrew's comments to say this too shall pass. This is a really tricky time to be in the higher education sector for all of us, and potentially more so as enabling educators than for us less engaged in that particular part of the higher education system. And I say that because the current legislative trend goes against the major global trends which are towards lifelong education and universal access. And as Andrew has showed us graphically, it also goes against the major demographic trends that are approaching us in this country, with the baby bonus bump hitting in mid-century. So I also think that both the political pressure and from community and from the sector will ratchet up and increase. And I really encourage you as a community of practitioners to put your case to the government, to increase the understanding of what enabling education does, how it transforms lives, how it provides a well-proven pathway to higher education and ultimately to a better life. And it benefits not just the individuals who participate in enabling programs, but it benefits us as a society, and it benefits the economy. And I think all of these points are worth making, particularly over the next 3 years, as there is wiggle room and potentially a political opportunity to put your case. So keep doing the good work that you're all doing. I know you're all very passionate about your students and what you do, but this is the time to potentially organize and put your case in an evidence-based way to the political actors and decision makers. So all the best with that endeavor.
Thank you.
And I assume I'm handing back to Sarah. Are we? You have to mute yourself.
Sorry.
Unmute.
Still an amateur. Thank you so much. My gosh, that was so amazing. I think no matter what role we have in enabling education, having that explained to us, the policy landscape explained to us, is just so important and amazing. So thank you to the three of you. We really appreciate and value your time, and it's it's a Friday and it's a couple of weeks away from Christmas, so thank you so much for your time. We are going to have an informal Zoom session, so if people would like to have a quick toilet break, that will be from 1:20 to 1:50 Australian Daylight Saving Time, so that's South Australian time, and then we will return for session 4, which will be chaired by Dr. Anna Bennett. And here we are again, shifting our focus to what's happening in the virtual space and our classrooms with COVID, and how we've been many of us who hadn't been teaching in the digital space really had to equip ourselves with skills. And we're going to have some fabulous showcases from lecturers from Newcastle Enabling Program and also here at UniSA College. So please come back for that session. And I think we can also, for those that have taken notes from today's session and also yesterday, we really want to bring us together for the final session that will be chaired by our chair of NAEEA, of our exec committee, Karen Seary, who for half an hour will try and gather us together to see how it is we can collaborate. We can think about what those strategies might be that have been suggested for us for the last couple of days as well, and how we can secure our sector. So thank you, everybody, and hopefully see you in the lunch Zoom that's available on the website. Thank you.
Thank you all.